It was another sweltering afternoon in Selma, Alabama. The air was thick, oppressive, and buzzing with the hum of cicadas in the trees. The sun beat down relentlessly, casting long shadows across the streets of this historic town. As Chad Whitmore, a deputy sheriff, cruised down Highland Avenue, the weight of his badge hung heavily on his chest. This was another routine patrol, nothing out of the ordinary. The same cracked asphalt, the same worn-out street signs, and the same quiet, almost eerie calm. But as he sipped his lukewarm coffee from a gas station cup, his mind began to wander, thinking about the weekend ahead, the barbecues, the quiet evenings at home. But then it happened. He spotted it. A black 2014 Cadillac CTS rolling through the intersection a little too fast. The yellow light flashed and the car was just a second too close to turning red. Whitmore's instincts kicked in his fingers, moving without thought as he flipped on the sirens. The harsh whoop of the siren cut through the stillness, breaking the silence of the otherwise peaceful street. The Cadillac smoothly pulled over to the side of the road. No sudden swerves, no hesitation. Nothing. The driver, whoever he was, didn't even flinch. That's odd, Whitmore thought. People usually react with some kind of nervous energy when they're being pulled over, but not this guy. Pause for a moment. Where are you watching from right now? Drop a comment below and let us know the time. It's fascinating to see how far these kinds of stories travel. If you've ever had to deal with authority or witnessed discrimination, stick around. You're going to want to hear the rest of this. Trust me, it only gets more intense. Whitmore got out of his patrol car, his boots making soft thuds on the hot pavement. He adjusted his belt, a habitual movement before approaching the driver's side window. The moment he reached the car, something about the man behind the wheel caught him off guard. The driver was an older black man, probably in his early 60s, dressed neatly in a short-sleeved button-up shirt. The type of man who didn't seem like he should be in trouble with the law. His posture was perfect, no slouch, and his eyes were sharp, studying Whitmore with a calm that bordered on unsettling. The kind of calm that immediately made Whitmore feel like he was the one who was being scrutinized. License and registration, Whitmore ordered, keeping his tone firm, authoritative. The man didn't immediately reach for his documents. Instead, he met Whitmore's eyes with a steady, almost unflinching gaze. "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" The voice was calm, precise, but not confrontational. Whitmore clenched his jaw. He hated it when people asked questions instead of just following orders. It was a subtle challenge to his authority. This is how it always starts, he thought. People questioning his decisions, questioning his power. "You ran a red light," Whitmore replied, his voice rough with irritation. The man glanced briefly at the intersection in his rearview mirror, then back at Whitmore with an eyebrow raised. "That light was yellow when I crossed it," the man said, his tone level, matter-of-fact. Whitmore's jaw tightened. This wasn't going how he'd imagined it. The man's calm was unnerving, like he knew something Whitmore didn't. "I'm sure of it," the driver added, his gaze unwavering. But Whitmore wasn't about to back down. He didn't have a dash cam to prove otherwise, but in his mind that didn't matter. His word was law, here. License and registration. He repeated, his patience already running thin. Finally, the man nodded. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached into the glove compartment and pulled out his documents. Whitmore watched, his eyes narrowing. The man wasn't fumbling, wasn't nervous. He handed over his registration and ID with such ease as if he had done this 1,000 times before. That bothered him. Whitmore glanced at the name on the driver's license. Samuel Reynolds. The name didn't ring any bells, but something about the way Reynolds handed over the documents, no hesitation, no sudden movements, made Whitmore's skin prickle. This man wasn't scared, and that was dangerous. "Step out of the car," Whitmore ordered. His voice was more forceful this time. Reynolds hesitated just for a moment, then looked up, meeting Whitmore's gaze with a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh. "Why?" he asked the word, carrying no anger, no resistance, just genuine curiosity. "Because I said so." Whitmore's patience was wearing thin, and the sudden shift in Reynolds's demeanor, a calm defiance, if you will, made Whitmore's blood boil. He wasn't used to being questioned like this. A tense silence passed. Reynolds held Whitmore's gaze a beat longer than most people would dare to, then slowly pushed open the door. He unfolded himself from the seat with ease, moving with a precision that made Whitmore's eyes narrow. This wasn't just any old man. Hands on the trunk, Whitmore barked, trying to regain control. Reynolds complied without protest, his hands gently resting against the Cadillac's rear, but as Whitmore began to pat him down, Reynolds muttered something under his breath. "This is unnecessary." Whitmore's jaw clenched. "Excuse me." He felt the familiar rush of irritation surge through him. "You have my ID. You ran my plates. You know I'm clean, but that didn't matter. What mattered was his power, and right now he was the one in control. Without thinking, Whitmore reached for his cuffs. The air shifted instantly, a palpable tension crackling in the space between them. Reynolds stiffened his body, going tense. "Turn around," Whitmore ordered. But Reynolds didn't move. That was the moment. The moment Whitmore made the one decision that would ruin everything. Stay tuned for what happens next, because what seemed like a routine traffic stop will soon spiral into something much, much bigger. Chad Whitmore's grip tightened on his cuffs as he reached for Samuel Reynolds' arm, preparing to twist him into a compliant position. Everything was moving too fast now, faster than he could think, but his pride refused to let him stop. He had been in control until now. For a brief moment, Reynolds's calmness unnerved him, but Whitmore pushed that discomfort aside. He had a job to do, a responsibility to uphold the law. If Reynolds wasn't going to comply, Whitmore was going to make him. But when his hand grabbed Reynolds's wrist, something shifted in the air between them. The older man moved with an unexpected fluidity faster than Whitmore had anticipated. It wasn't like resisting. It was as though Reynolds had been trained to deal with this very scenario, as if he had faced down officers like Whitmore 1,000 times before and knew exactly how to break a hold. Whitmore froze for a split second, caught off guard by the swift motion. "But pride, the thing that had fueled this entire encounter, wouldn't let him let go," I said. "Turn around," Whitmore demanded, his voice shaky. The facade of authority beginning to crack. Reynolds didn't answer. Instead, looking at him with the same unflinching stare that had unsettled Whitmore from the very first moment. That calm, measured look on Reynolds's face made him question himself for the first time since he had become a cop. For a moment, the world around them seemed to go still. A hush seemed to fall over the street, as though time itself had paused to watch this particular moment unfold. And as Reynolds stared back, something else, something deeper than frustration, crept into Whitmore's chest. Doubt about his actions, about the way he was treating this man who was calm, composed, and not the fearful subject Whitmore expected. Whitmore's hand tightened again around Reynolds's wrist, but the older man didn't fight back. He didn't resist. Instead, he sighed. A slow, controlled exhale, as though he had seen all this before, and was simply waiting for Whitmore to come to his senses. "Officer, I strongly suggest you think carefully about what you're doing." Reynolds' voice carried no anger. There was no edge, no intimidation, just quiet suggestion. And that was the thing that gnawed at Whitmore. The older man wasn't scared. That wasn't normal. "You're refusing to comply." Whitmore snapped his hand, pushing Reynolds' arm back with unnecessary force. There was a sharp edge to his voice, a reminder that Whitmore was the one with the badge, with the power. But Reynolds wasn't fazed. Not by the words, not by the force. Instead, he just stood there. His calm presence only fueled Whitmore's anger. "I'm not resisting," Reynolds said evenly. His eyes locked on Whitmore's, sharper than ever. "I'm questioning an unlawful detainment." It felt like a slap in the face to Whitmore, who was used to being the one in control. His grip tightened further, the cuffs clicking open in the air between them as he attempted to force Reynolds around. Reynolds let out a small sigh, not out of fear but out of frustration, like he had to deal with this type of abuse regularly. That was the part that hurt Whitmore the most. The calmness, the patience, the way Reynolds didn't react like any of the other suspects Whitmore had encountered. With a sudden movement, Whitmore shoved Reynolds against the trunk of the Cadillac. The older man grunted as his body hit the metal with a heavy thud. His shoulder blades connected with the sharp edge of the trunk, but still he didn't fight. He didn't yell. He didn't even break stride. Whitmore's arm pressed hard against Reynolds's back, and he yanked his arms behind his back with the cold, mechanical precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times. The metal of the handcuffs bit into Reynolds' wrists, and Whitmore muttered, "You're under arrest." "For what?" Reynolds's voice was calm. Too calm, that question lingered in the air, hanging like a cloud. Whitmore couldn't escape. Obstruction, interfering with an officer's investigation. Those words were all he could think of. He opened his mouth to speak, but no justification came to mind. He had already made his decision, and now needed something. Anything to make it feel right. Obstruction, he finally muttered. But even as the word left his mouth, it didn't sit right. It sounded weak, like a hollow excuse. Reynolds let out a slow breath, the disappointment palpable in his tone. "This is a mistake, officer." He wasn't fighting back. He wasn't angry. He simply sounded tired. That was the moment when Whitmore realized that something was seriously wrong. As Reynolds was shoved into the back of the patrol car, still calm, still unshaken, Whitmore tried to convince himself that it was all just part of the job. Another day, another arrest. That's all it was. Until he looked at the man through the bars of the partition. Reynolds was sitting back against the seat completely at ease, as if he had been here 1,000 times before. "You're not so calm now," Whitmore muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Reynolds. But the older man's gaze met his through the rearview mirror with steady, unwavering certainty. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Reynolds asked, his voice surprisingly warm despite the situation. Whitmore scoffed. "Should I?" His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, trying to maintain the upper hand, but Reynolds held his gaze for a moment longer as if he had already seen this play out in his mind. And Whitmore knew deep down that something was going to happen. Something that would turn this entire situation on its head. Stay tuned, because in just a few moments, Whitmore will discover exactly who Samuel Reynolds is, and it's a name that's about to send shockwaves through the system. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this story unfolds. Make sure you hit that subscribe button to follow this gripping tale to the very end. You're in for a shocking revelation. As Chad Whitmore drove in silence, his eyes flicking nervously from the rearview mirror to the road ahead, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling gnawing at him. Samuel Reynolds, the man he had just arrested, had been far too calm, far too collected for someone caught in the middle of a routine traffic stop. Whitmore had spent his entire career on the streets, used to dealing with nervous civilians, irritated drivers, or even those who tried to fight back. But Reynolds, he was different. That unnerving, almost eerie calmness still lingered in his mind. Was this man hiding something? He couldn't quite place it, but he knew deep down that this wasn't going to be as easy as he had first thought. Pulling into the station, Whitmore parked the cruiser in the lot with a sense of finality. He had done his duty right. He had made an arrest, issued a citation, and everything would go smoothly from here on out. But the unease simmered just below the surface. The moment Reynolds had looked at him through the rearview mirror, something had changed. There was a quiet, unspoken understanding. In that gaze, a hint of knowing like Reynolds was just waiting for the storm to hit, and as Whitmore stepped out of the car and moved to the holding area, the weight of the situation was beginning to settle heavily on his shoulders. He walked past the front desk where the usual hum of activity seemed louder than usual. Phones were ringing, officers were whispering, and the air felt thick with tension. It was just a typical day at the station, but something was off. Whitmore tried to shake the feeling, focusing instead on the task at hand. He made his way toward the holding cells where Reynolds was waiting, as calm as ever. The sight of him sitting with his hands folded neatly in his lap was like a mirror reflecting Whitmore's own turmoil. When Sergeant Roger Simmons walked into the room, Whitmore knew instantly that something was wrong. The man's face was a storm cloud. his expression filled with disbelief. His voice was thick with anger when he spoke. "Whitmore, get in my office now." Whitmore's stomach dropped. He followed Simmons through the narrow corridor, the weight of the impending conversation pressing on him. As they reached Simmons' office, Whitmore took a seat across from him, trying to appear confident, but failing. He had never been in this situation before. He was used to giving orders, not being on the receiving end of one. "You mind telling me why the hell I have a U.S. Army colonel sitting in our holding cell?" Simmons' voice was like a whip cracking through the air. Whitmore blinked, stunned by the question. A colonel. Before he could form a response, Simmons slammed the phone onto the desk, his face pale with anger. "Colonel Samuel Reynolds, 30 years of service, 2 tours overseas. He's got a Pentagon security clearance, a direct line to the Secretary of Defense, and you just threw him in a cell like some common criminal." The blood drained from Whitmore's face. Colonel Reynolds. The same man he had just arrested, the man he had treated like a suspect. The truth hit Whitmore like a freight train. This wasn't just any old traffic stop. This was a mistake of monumental proportions, one that was now going to be felt all the way up the chain of command. "What the hell were you thinking?" "Whitmore." Simmons spat his voice dangerously low. "Did you even check his ID before you decided to flex your ego on the side of the road?" Whitmore's throat tightened. He had acted on impulse, on instinct, but now he realized just how badly he had miscalculated. Reynolds wasn't just an average citizen. He was a decorated military officer, a man who had served his country with honor. And yet, Whitmore had treated him like just another suspect, someone to be bullied into submission. Simmons gestured toward the window, where Whitmore could see the chaos unfolding just outside his office. Phones were ringing non-stop, and officers were whispering in tight circles. At the front desk, a group of men in suits stood with stiff postures and cold expressions, their eyes sharp with scrutiny. Federal agents. The realization hit Whitmore like a slap in the face. This was bigger than just him. "You realize what you just did, don't you?" Simmons continued, his voice thick with disbelief. "You put cuffs on a man who has more authority, more training, and more clearance than you'll ever have. And now we're all going to pay for it." Whitmore opened his mouth to speak, to try and defend his actions, but the words wouldn't come. He felt like he was suffocating. The consequences were spiraling out of control. A crackling voice came through the intercom, and Whitmore's heart sank. 104, what's the charge?" It was dispatch following up on his report. "I don't know," Whitmore muttered, his voice barely audible. I just arrested him for obstruction, for interfering with an officer's investigation." He felt ridiculous saying it aloud. Simmons didn't respond. He simply grabbed a file from his desk and slammed it onto Whitmore's chest. "This is an internal review, Whitmore. We're going to look into every single one of your stops over the past year. Every one of them." The words hit Whitmore like a sledgehammer. An internal review. His mind raced as he thought about all the previous stops he had made, the citizens he had questioned, the unjust actions he had taken. How many of them had been racially motivated? How many of those had been unfair? How many were against black men and women, just like Colonel Reynolds? He felt sick to his stomach. Everything he thought he knew about his own behavior was coming undone. As Whitmore left Simmons's office, his mind was spinning. He could already hear the whispers in the halls. His colleagues were watching him, waiting for the fallout. He had gone from being a confident officer to the subject of scorn in a matter of minutes. But it wasn't over for Chad Whitmore. What he didn't realize yet was that Colonel Reynolds wasn't just going to walk away quietly. This was going to spark a movement, and Whitmore, he was about to become the face of a scandal that could change everything he ever knew about power, race, and justice. Don't miss what happens next, because the real story is only just beginning. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the shocking twists to come. The days following Chad Whitmore's arrest of Colonel Samuel Reynolds felt like an endless spiral. Whitmore sat in his small apartment, the harsh glow of the TV casting long shadows across the room. It was late, but he couldn't sleep. His mind raced, replaying every single moment of that traffic stop. How had it gone so wrong? Why hadn't he seen it? The signs were all there. Reynolds wasn't the typical suspect. He wasn't a nervous young man rattling in the passenger seat of a patrol car. He was a seasoned soldier, a man with more authority than Whitmore could even comprehend. But Whitmore hadn't seen that. Instead, he had seen a black man calm and composed, and something about that had triggered him, made him feel like he had to reassert his dominance. The idea had felt justifiable at the time, but now in the cold light of hindsight, it was a mistake that threatened to unravel everything he had ever known. As he switched off the TV and sat there in silence, the sound of his phone buzzing broke through the stillness. It was a text from his union rep, one of the few people still willing to talk to him. "We need to talk. Call me." He stared at the message, his stomach sinking. That's it, he thought. This is where it all ends. The next day, he reported for duty. His face pale, his jaw clenched. The tension in the air at the station was palpable. Whitmore could feel the eyes on him, the hushed whispers as he walked through the hallways. He didn't need to look up to know the suspicions were already spreading. He was the man who had crossed the line, the one who had put a veteran soldier, a colonel, in cuffs. For no reason other than the fact that he didn't know how to handle being questioned. The department was already in crisis mode, and Whitmore was at the center of it. The media was already digging through every stop he had ever made, every arrest, every search, every questionable decision, and each one seemed to speak 1,000 words that he wished he could take back. By mid-morning, he was summoned into the captain's office. Roger Simmons was standing by the window, his arms crossed, his face hard. The tension was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Whitmore hesitated at the door, feeling the weight of his own actions. He stepped inside and the door clicked shut behind him. Simmons didn't waste time. "We've already received calls from the military. Senior officials are demanding answers," he began. "And the federal agents, they're here demanding a full investigation." Whitmore stood still, his throat tight. The pressure was mounting. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the whole department, the whole system. The way things worked, the way power was enforced, the systemic racism that still pervaded every corner of law enforcement. He had no idea how deep this ran. He had no idea what he had just set in motion. Simmons continued, his voice low, but filled with authority. "We've got an internal review of your record," he said, his tone sharp. "They're looking into your stops, your arrests. The pattern is clear. Whitmore, over 80% of your stops were black men, and the vast majority of them were without cause. The racial profiling is undeniable." The words hit Whitmore like a punch to the gut. He knew it wasn't just about Reynolds anymore. He had been caught in a web of his own making, a web woven from years of unchecked power, unexamined bias, and blind privilege. He hadn't been the innocent officer he had always believed himself to be. He had been the embodiment of authority unchecked, and now it was all coming crashing down. "I didn't target them," Whitmore protested weakly, but the words fell flat. "I was just doing my job." Simmons sighed, rubbing his temples. "Your job was to serve and protect, not to act as a judge, jury, and executioner. The badge you wear is meant to represent justice, not bias." His eyes softened for a brief moment, but then the stern expression returned. "Do you understand the gravity of this? Your actions, they have consequences. Not just for you, but for the entire department. For every officer who's ever had their integrity questioned." Whitmore wanted to protest. He wanted to argue that this wasn't who he was. But deep down, he knew the truth. His actions had spoken louder than any defense he could offer. "You need to go home, Whitmore. I'm putting you on leave until further notice." Simmons said, his voice cold. "The review is underway, and if this turns out to be a pattern, you won't be coming back. That's a promise." As Whitmore walked out of the office, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. There was no hiding now. The truth had come to light, and it was ugly. He wasn't the only one in this mess. There were other officers who had turned a blind eye to racial profiling, biased policing, and discriminatory practices. But now that he was the one under investigation, everything was falling apart. At home, the phone calls didn't stop. His union rep, the press, his lawyer, all demanding answers. It wasn't just his career on the line anymore. It was his entire reputation, the reputation of the department, and the trust of the community he was supposed to serve. His thoughts kept drifting back to Colonel Reynolds, to the man who had questioned Whitmore's actions with nothing but quiet dignity. That was the turning point for Whitmore. Reynolds had become the symbol of everything Whitmore wasn't: calm, composed, and grounded in a system he knew all too well. But Reynolds had also seen the worst of that system. And now, as the investigation deepened, Whitmore understood that Reynolds wasn't just another civilian. He was part of something much bigger, something that could bring change. But this wasn't the end of the story. Chad Whitmore was about to discover just how much power someone like Colonel Reynolds could wield, not just for himself, but for an entire movement. Stay tuned, because the battle for justice has only just begun. And believe me, the real fight is only starting now. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the shocking conclusion. The days after Chad Whitmore was placed on leave felt like a blur. It wasn't just the endless cycle of phone calls, meetings, and interviews. It was the haunting realization that he was now the focal point of a storm he had set in motion, one that was threatening to consume not only his career, but the very system he had once sworn to protect. As the internal review continued, it became clear that the investigation was much broader than he could have ever imagined. The pattern was undeniable, and Whitmore was now one of many officers under scrutiny for systemic racial profiling. But in his mind, he couldn't shake one thing: the moment he had arrested Colonel Reynolds, and the calm, almost prophetic words that Reynolds had spoken to him. In the days following his suspension, Reynolds' story had gone viral. The media had picked it up, and now Reynolds wasn't just a retired Army officer. He was a symbol, the face of the movement for police accountability. Everyone from civil rights activists to political leaders to community organizers had rallied behind him. He was no longer just the man Whitmore had tried to arrest that day. He had become a voice for the oppressed, for the black community, for those who had suffered under the weight of racist policing for far too long. His message was clear: no more. No more unjust arrests, no more blind authority, and most importantly, no more standing by, while people like Whitmore wielded power without accountability. Whitmore sat at his kitchen table watching Reynolds' press conference on his phone. The image of Reynolds standing at a podium flanked by military officials, his expression firm and dignified, sent a wave of guilt crashing over him. He had thought that by arresting Reynolds he was asserting control, that he was doing his job. But what he didn't realize was that he had embarrassed himself. Reynolds, the former colonel, the man with years of service, had been right all along. Whitmore had acted out of pride, out of unexamined bias, and now the whole world knew it. In that moment, Whitmore realized something. This wasn't about him anymore. This was bigger than one man. This was about an entire system that had been broken for years. It wasn't just about Reynolds. It was about every black man, every black woman, every person of color who had been unjustly targeted by law enforcement. The community had had enough, and Reynolds had given them a voice. The sound of his phone ringing pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was his union rep, Jack Morgan. The same rep who had been his lifeline throughout his career, the one who had helped him out of tight situations before. He answered quickly, his stomach twisting. "Chad, we need to talk." Jack's voice was tense, not the usual calm reassurance Whitmore was used to. There was no more comforting tone, no more, "we'll figure it out." Instead, there was a sense of urgency. "The city's got a meeting this afternoon. It's with the mayor, the DOJ, and a whole bunch of civil rights organizations. They're demanding reform." Whitmore could feel his pulse quicken. The weight of it all was suffocating. "They want to make an example out of me, don't they? It's not just you, Chad. It's the entire department. Your actions. This isn't just about a single traffic stop anymore. The black community is mobilized and they're not backing down. The mayor is under pressure to implement new oversight policies. The media's got a hold of this and they're not letting go. Whitmore didn't know how to respond. The truth was, he had seen this coming, the slow, inevitable downfall. But he hadn't realized just how far-reaching the consequences would be. That afternoon, Whitmore found himself sitting in a large conference room, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been called in by the city council to discuss the incident. The room was filled with politicians, civil rights leaders, and a few familiar faces from the press. At the far end of the room, Reynolds was seated with his lawyer, looking composed like he had been here 1,000 times before. Whitmore, on the other hand, felt like he was walking into the lion's den. He was no longer the confident officer he had once been. The man who had made countless traffic stops, issued hundreds of citations, and always felt in control, he was gone. Instead, he was facing a room full of people who were angry, who had every right to be angry. But as he looked at Reynolds, he saw something else, something that Whitmore hadn't expected. Reynolds wasn't angry. Not at him. He wasn't vindictive. He was calm, resolute, like he knew that this wasn't just about retribution. This was about change, real change. And Whitmore had become part of the problem. "Officer Whitmore!" a woman's voice called out, snapping him from his thoughts. It was Monica James, a black activist who had been vocal about police reform. She was a leader in the fight against racial injustice in Selma. "We're here today to discuss a broken system." She continued, her eyes hard as they focused on him. "We're here to ask why officers like you think it's okay to target black people on a regular basis. Why black men and women are treated like criminals by the people who are supposed to protect them." Whitmore opened his mouth to speak, but his words faltered. He had been on the defensive for so long, but now in front of this room of people, he realized just how much damage had been done. This wasn't just about his career anymore. This was about an entire community that had been systematically oppressed for years. And now, because of one moment of unchecked power, he had become the face of that oppression. At the other end of the room, Reynolds stood up. His calm demeanor had not changed one bit. He looked at Whitmore, his eyes piercing, yet not filled with hatred. There was a sense of quiet understanding in his gaze, like he knew what was coming, but wasn't afraid of it. "This isn't just about what happened that day." Reynolds began, his voice strong and clear. "This is about a system that has allowed racist behavior to flourish for far too long. This is about how people of color are treated differently by law enforcement simply because of the color of their skin." The room fell silent. Whitmore was no longer just an officer. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. But as the meeting went on, it became clear Whitmore's life was about to change forever. His career, his reputation, everything he thought he knew about being a cop was about to come crashing down. And Reynolds, who had every reason to hold a grudge, was standing at the front of the charge for real reform. Stay tuned, because what happens next is going to be a turning point, not just for Whitmore, but for the future of law enforcement in Selma. Hit that subscribe button and don't miss the shocking truth about what happens when accountability finally catches up with the people who thought they were untouchable. As Whitmore stood there facing the consequences of his actions, it was clear that this moment would define not just his future, but also the future of law enforcement. In Selma, accountability had finally come knocking, but the road ahead was filled with hard questions and tough decisions. What's your take on this? Do you believe true change is possible in our justice system? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your perspective in the comments below, and make sure to hit subscribe to stay tuned for more updates and powerful stories that matter.